Welcome to Wildlife Investments, where we discuss wildlife research, habitat, hunting, and land management with our panel of leading resource managers. Wildlife Investments, resource management by scientists.
Today, we are joined by Dr. Brady Self. Brady is an extension forester for Mississippi State University. And we had a devastating event that occurred in North Mississippi as well as adjacent states. And that's the cold weather and the ice that we experienced a few weeks ago. And we wanted to visit with Brady. He's already been on the ground, countless properties he has visited over the past week or so. And we wanted to visit with Brady about what he's seeing, and in terms of when the damage is too bad, what are going to be some options for people, and maybe end up with, even though we had this really, really devastating event, and I think Brady can share that for some people, life-altering in terms of their plans for their property and what they wanted to do and monetize the timber and so forth. Hopefully, we can end up with some opportunities. I'm hoping we can dig up some bright spots for people, but maybe not. And of course, that all depends on their objectives and what they want to do with their property and the opportunities they're in. So, Brady, first of all, thank you for joining us. I know you have been wide open busy with phone calls and site visits, and people have been bombarding you recently with what are we going to do? How bad is it? What are we going to do? So first of all, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time. And maybe we can just start with kind of the environmental events. I mean, I broadly just said, cold temperatures and ice, but could you possibly, Brady, go through what stands were most vulnerable? Was there a basal area? Was there an age class? What stands maybe could grow out of this situation? Was there differentially effects with pine versus hardwood? Maybe just kind of a big picture. Tell us about what you're seeing and what stands were affected most.
Sure. It's kind of interesting to be a hardwood guy and talking about pine so much right now, right? But it's the nature of the job. But for the most part, I haven't seen a lot of damage in the hardwoods. Some of the more brittle species, if for lack of better terminology, the gums and cottonwood and sycamore and stuff like that. And heaven forbid you had a sawtooth oak in your yard. Or Bradford pear. Some of those, you get a little bit of damage, a little bit of top breakage and splitting and stuff like that. But for the most part, we didn't get enough ice accumulated on most of our trees to really cause a lot of problem in the hardwood world. If you go back to the one in 94, the ice storm that we had across the north part of the state, I was 14 or 15 and we had 3 inches of ice on our trees up in the northeast part of the state. That one broke up hardwoods. I mean, that one annihilated a lot of hardwoods out there. This one didn't have that kind of impact on hardwoods. That said, obviously, the other category there is going to be pines, and that's where we saw the vast majority of the damage this time around. Now, that said, the one in 94, we didn't have all the pines to contend with that we do now either. So, the incentive programs and everything else in the mid-90s really started building that surplus of pine up across the north part of the state, across the state in general, but especially in the north part with those low markets. Once you got into the pines this time around, kind of very rough generalizations. If I want to throw numbers out, if it was just planted or maybe 2 or 3 years old, probably not a big deal on them. A lot of them bent to the ground, and I've got some pretty cool photos that I took. When did it end? The 26th of January, I think. It was that Monday. So the 26th of January, I went out and took some photos on my hunting club here south of Grenada. a lot of trees that were in that 5 or 6 year range and on up to maybe 10. They're bent over. Some of them were literally touching the ground. I have a photo I took that I said I'm going to put in my hardwood presentation. So, as I walk by, the pines bow to me. I mean, every stinking pine was bent over and touching the ground. And I went back Sunday afternoon, this past Sunday afternoon, so roughly 2 weeks after, and every one of them is back up. They may not be perfectly vertical, but every one of them, without, I don't think I saw one that was broke over in those younger age classes. Every one of them standing straight back up, maybe a little bit of bend, but by the time summer gets here, those are going to be okay. So you move forward into that, 6 to 10, 12-year range like that. A lot of those are bent over, some breakage depending on how much ice accumulation you had. But as a whole, most of those are okay. Most of those will probably be all right. Most of them are going to have a little bit of structural damage at the top. Maybe the terminals are snapped out. Maybe some of the branches, that kind of thing. It's once you get into the next age class, right? When you get into that 12, maybe on the bottom end, 15-year-old up to about 25-year-old, where you get a lot of height growth, but you don't get that corresponding diameter growth until they mature. That's where you started seeing the damage, even in unthinned stands where, some of those stands are probably 30, 40% broken. Not the average stand that I've looked at, but probably 30 to 40% would be the upper end of that, of actual snapping, breaking off of the tree, structural, stem breakage. I would say probably 10 to 15% would be more normal on those, unless they were thinned. And if you thin something in the last, 5, 6 years, I've seen stands that were 99% broken off. I mean, I'm talking, it looks like somebody ran a bush hog over the top of those stands. They're horrible, anywhere from 5 or 6 feet off the ground all the way up to 30, 35 feet, and just the stem snapped in half. We can talk later about salvage, potential in a stand like that, but it's not pretty. And then you get into the older age class. Once you get into that 25, 30-year range or older than that, unless it had been thinned or it was just out in the open, where it has lots and lots of foliage to collect that ice and accumulate, really didn't see as much damage there. Maybe, some top breakage here and there down, terminal break off the top 5 feet of the tree, 6, 8 feet of the tree, something like that. And then some branches would break off. But as a whole, most of those stands did okay. They didn't have the the devastating type breakage of large scale across the stand that you saw in those pulpwood size stands. So that's rough numbers, rough. And again, that's generalizations. There's always exceptions to that, but kind of what I'm seeing, and that's Yazoo County all the way up the bluff into Panola County, and at Panola County they kind of the top. So Panola Tate County line. They kind of have a line where temperatures were cold enough that they got snow and ice instead of freezing rain. Below that, temperatures were high enough that they had just rain. So you get to there and above, you kind of just had ice on the ground and you had snow and things like that. Bad on the infrastructure side, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of people up there with, smashed tractor sheds and things like that, but trees, not so much. Then you come across going east in the state. It kind of runs out over around New Albany, Pontotoc, down. So Union and Pontotoc counties, not that much damage of major consequence to the east. You go into the north part of the state. I'm told, I haven't been up there, but Tishomingo County on the east side isn't too bad. On the west side and the north is pretty bad. So anything between there and Marshall, you have some serious damage. Hadn't heard numbers from the Forestry Commission yet. I've tried. They just haven't got them yet. They're working on it, but they have not been able to get planes up and get a good handle on how much damage is there. But when those numbers are available, they're going to make them public from an acreage standpoint. A lot of damage, whole lot of trees on the ground, and it is life altering for a lot of people.
So what are some options, Brady? We've got you brought up the topic of salvage a moment ago.
Hmm?
So I assume we're going to have some situations where hey, you're taking a little bit of a loss, but the amount of loss is not going to justify hitting the reset button. You're just going to have to grow out of it. Maybe keep your fingers crossed when I assume summer and fall with insect damage and so forth. So let's not maybe talk about those. Let's talk about the people that are going to have need some type of action.
Mhm.
And then
Oh,
and then I guess ultimately that culminates in, there's nothing we can do, and you just have to walk away from it. Let's talk about that as well.
sure. They kind of go reverse from where your brain takes you, right? With the worst to the best, go the best to the worst. Okay. Best stands didn't get any damage, right? That's pretty straightforward. If you're in those counties outside of the ones I mentioned there, you're probably sitting either in that category or real close to it. You start moving in, from the, just say lateral across the state. You start moving into those regions. You get into some stands that were, for messed up, so to speak. You get the tops that are broken. You get the branches that were broken off, things like that. Those are probably manageable if you just from whatever purpose you're wanting to manage them. From a timber production standpoint or whatever wildlife work you're wanting to do with manipulating those densities. Good luck with thinning, and we all know where that goes from a market standpoint. But especially with all the wood that's on the ground right now. But those stands are probably manageable. They're probably going to live, assuming we don't have a bad beetle outbreak or something like that comes along. Once you get into those that are 50% busted, you get into those where you've got 50% of the trees on the ground or something like that. Maybe even 35 or 40, depending on what you have and how much residual you maintain. Those are the ones you really got to start thinking about. What do I do? Where do I want to take this thing? And when you get into those situations, kind of a rule of thumb is about 50 square foot of basal area is what we're looking at for it to be manageable from a forestry standpoint. Um, at that point, you're almost thinning it with the damage that happened. Again, assuming that you didn't wind up having something happen to you later on in the year, those stands are probably going to be manageable as you go forward too. If you can get it salvaged, which is very unlikely in a lot of cases, 50 square foot, 60 square foot, something like that will be enough for you to have a commercially viable stand moving into the future. Once you start getting lower than that, into that 40 range, that's where we kind of start questioning whether it's going to be something that we are going to be able to manage. Not necessarily that 40 square foot won't work from a forestry standpoint. And I know it's where you guys like to be on the deer side. It's that the residuals, you don't have any, we didn't pick it. That stand took, a lot of times it took the best trees because they had the most foliage, right? So you don't have the ability to pick your residual trees once you get into those lower basal areas. And there's, even though they're there, they're technically going to live, and they're going to have that subsequent lower value in saw timber. You're also going to be looking at trees that are going to be more susceptible to all the other elements that are out there, whatever those may be. We can talk about those later. Once you get lower than that, you get into those stands that are, 60, 70, 80, 90, 95% damaged. Like I said, I've seen some that you might have one tree in 100. Those are do-overs, absolutely do-overs, probably from whatever aspect you look at it. Once you start looking at those stands, from a commercial standpoint, commercial forestry standpoint, there's really nothing there. So it's you hit that reset button that you mentioned. You pull that lever, push whatever button it is, and do over. Now, that doesn't mean people are going to do something over. That doesn't mean that they're actually going to actively manage that stand moving forward as a timber stand or anything else. I hate to say it, but and like we talked about before we started recording here, I really do think that a lot of those people are probably just going to walk away. They were disgusted to begin with. Because of our timber markets, and we all, we don't need to beat that drum too much, but they weren't good before. They're really not going to be good now. And without some incentive to replant it, and they don't see an incentive to replant it, they're probably going to walk away. I hate to say that, but I really think that's probably going to be the case. I like telling people there's 4 options, right? That's one of them. One of them is, and we touched on this a little bit too, is somehow you ring it and you throw a match in it. That has all kind of logistical problems. How do you get a dozer to push through that? How do you get it, get those lanes put in? And then not only that, but finding somebody that will take the liability of lighting that fire. And we've seen that with tornadoes, right? Tornadoes are uh, similar. You probably get more damage where it's, at the core, obviously, but more damage in a very concentrated place, and where this is much, much wider spread. And in those situations, finding somebody that'll light those stands on fire can be really, really tough because nobody wants to touch it. And not to mention it's dangerous, right? You can't walk through that safely while you're trying to light a fire from an internal to the boundaries kind of thing. So a lot of that's ringing it. You're just putting a big ring around that fire, around that property with fire, and you light it on and fire and stand back and watch the show. And the problem with that is it's, as you know, you don't have a lot of control when something's that big and you have that much fuel burning. So I think that'll probably happen some, but I don't think it's going to happen wholesale. Then you have another option, which is, and of course, after that burning, you can replant or you can do whatever you want, from a normal forestry perspective. You're still going to have some cleanup, but at least you can interplant it, right?
With that though, Brady, do you have a recommended time interval that you'd wait before you try to move somebody in to burn it? Like obviously, if you burn it now, just like new piles after a logging operation, new piles rarely want to burn just because they still have a lot of moisture in them. Do you have kind of a rule of thumb for that?
If you had enough fuel to burn it this spring, and granted, in a stand like that, you're going to have all those down tops, so you're going to have enough fuel, right? You're just not going to burn up the big logs. And you could get somebody to do it. Probably would be better than waiting until the end of the summer, right? Until you get those logs and the larger material really drying out. But I think it all comes back to just finding somebody. It's going to be hard to find somebody to do it. But yeah, if you could somehow keep from having those fuels that are going to stay on fire for a month, which would be earlier in the year here that we're talking about, yeah, that's probably not a bad idea. But everybody's shell shocked. I mean, you need to be putting lanes in right now to do that. And a lot of those properties where you had thinning jobs and things like that are more recent, they kind of have more highly managed properties anyway. A lot of those people burn, believe it or not. A fair number of those burn that I've looked at. So they didn't have the fine fuels on the ground before this. So they're going to have to give it some time to build those back up, and then we're right back at square one. I don't know that really answers your question, but
Brady, you touched on salvage cuts there and the difficulty, and obviously we had a lot of trouble with just getting thinning done to start with. But can you just speak to how this storm has changed the game with the market and just the amount of product, and whether there are any kind of classes of trees that a landowner might have that are down that might be able to be salvage cut?
Sure. And a lot of that depends on your location, right? So in my region over here in the Northwest, you really couldn't get anything done before, and you're really, really not going to be able to do it now. But assuming you have markets for that wood to begin with, we don't have saw hands anymore. And just call it what it is. So horizontal timber is a lot harder to get salvaged than vertical timber. Just the way it is. But everything's designed, all the equipment, to cut trees that are standing, not trees that are laying on their sides. So it gets to be incredibly difficult in that scenario for you to be able to harvest pines, period. Pines that are small diameter stuff, so pulpwood and small diameter saw logs, very, very, very unlikely you're going to get much of that harvested, even if it isn't broken up. The other thing is they want full length logs, right? They don't want things that are broken in half. And then you get all kinds of issues going on up and down the log with fractures and things like that in that wood too. So standing trees that you're wanting to harvest, leaning trees, those are going to be easier to salvage than something that's laying on the ground to begin with. The other thing that kind of plays into that is if you were already, and a lot of those loggers right now, we don't really know what the markets are doing. stands to reason they're going to be flooded. But a lot of the loggers were in the woods. I mean, their equipment was in the woods, so they're having to cut their way out. My guess is a lot of those are out at this point. But if you have somebody there already set up on site, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier than getting them to come back later on. So I've talked to a couple of people at this point that, I mean, one literally just then a couple 100 acres, and they were sitting at the back. The logger had like 20 acres left. Logger called and said, "Okay, do you want me to just clear cut it?" And they absolutely, cut it down. Now they probably lost 50-60% of the standing trees that were there that the logger had to leave because of the things I just mentioned. But they did harvest that stand because they had somebody there on site. It cost a lot of money for a logger to move in. And getting one to come back to a stand like that is going to be not impossible, but it's going to be incredibly difficult. Large saw timber, if there is of the right quality, standing trees, trees that just lost the very top of the crowns, those are going to be the ones that are going to have more value than the stuff that's on the ground already, or the stuff that snapped off halfway up the tree. Little bit of hardwood damage that was done out there, you probably get, because it's more valuable, you're probably going to be able to get somebody to take that over the pine too.
Okay. So the horizontal versus vertical issue, is that any different with hardwoods versus pine?
No, realistically, not as much anymore. It's just you got a product that has a lot more value associated with it, so they're willing to go out and get somebody to do that kind of work. It comes down to insurance. They can't afford to keep a saw hand on deck anymore. But even at that rate, so if it's laying on its side, you have to buck it on the ground and then and limb it up and then haul it out. There are some that do that kind of work in hardwoods. Finding them to do it in pines, unless they already bought the pine. If the buyer already has money invested in it, it's pretty tough. You had a question earlier. I heard before when we logged in too about longevity of stuff on the ground, and you're talking about hardwoods, but pines is much, 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 much shorter. Technically 3 or 4 months. Historically, you could say 6 months, but technically 3 or 4 months. Before that, wood becomes unmarketable basically for a timber buyer. And what it boils down to is everything's cut and hauled on the tonnage rating now instead of on the board feet. So it starts losing weight the second it hits the ground, and it's just not valuable enough for them to take it after that period of time. Plus, blue stain, it's a fungus that sets up in that wood. There are mills that won't take wood that's more than a month old if you get right down to it, and it's just you just can't sell it. Hardwoods, not the same kind of considerations. You can get 2 or 3 years out of big logs if they're in the right environment out there on the ground. And what they'll do in that case is they'll just slab the rotting portion of the tree off. Now, you're not going to get the same dollar amount per ton for hardwood logs that are on the ground that are 2 years old that you do for standing trees, but you can still sell them, and they'll just slab that outside off, and because they're still valuable wood on the inside. But you're looking at something that's 2 or 3 times the value of pine to begin with, and that's how they do that kind of work.
Brady, you've mentioned the term two or 3 times, saw hand.
Chainsaw hand.
Explain.
Literally a guy that runs a chainsaw. That's what we're talking about. Used to be a valued and necessary member of any logging operation that was out there. They don't exist anymore, and it all goes back to insurance. It was the most expensive position to insure on a logging crew. And loggers get a bad rep. They do, and obviously we can't do our work without them, and it gets hard to do wildlife work without them in a lot of cases. But the problem with that whole profession, and people really don't want to believe you, they go, "Oh, I see what they drive. Everything they own is owned by the bank, right?" 1%. That's 1 to 2% is the normal profit margin for a logging operation. They don't make a lot of profit, so anything they do that makes them lose money, one bad job can theoretically put one of them out of business. So they're very careful. And something like this, they couldn't make money on that pulpwood before. They really can't make money on now. You're just not going to get them there. They're just not going to cut. And again, that depends on location and things like that. Other parts of the state, not as bad. and they're not going to have that flood of wood either that they do here. It's a bad, perfect storm for landowners that are in those affected areas.
How long will that flood of wood affect the markets in, let's say, just North Mississippi, Brady?
And that's a good question, and that we've thrown that around amongst several of us in the past couple of weeks. Again, in theory, a lot of that wood should be gone inside of 6 months, right? I'd say give it a year. I mean, that's rough numbers, and I can't prove that, but that's talking with a couple of economists and foresters and people that are in the field doing that, buying and selling. Their guess is probably a year, maybe a little bit more before you see prices kind of come back down. Now, obviously not regionally speaking, but on a local level, in theory, again, you should see higher prices at the end of it, right? You lost a lot of wood. Who knows? We can't predict tomorrow what our prices are going to be, but economists love doing that. But I mean, realistically, it's very, very difficult to assign a value, tomorrow. It's really hard to assign one next month, and even almost impossible next year. So theoretically, you should see prices come back in a year or so, and that's what I'm told. But again, I'm not an economist.
This may be more of an economist question than Brady, and you and I, over the years, we joust academically about our professions, and we have fun doing that. But a genuine question is, me coming through school in the 90s, forestry, at least as we understood it then, it was a darn good investment. It was very, very reliable. Pulpwood markets were really, really good. Of course, saw timber as always. But I'm really struggling now to, if you owned a piece of property. So let's say, Brady, you become the long lost uncle, leaves you a great amount of money or gifts you a property.
Not happening,
And
but
you're
keep going.
hypothetical. How reliable is planting and investing in timber nowadays? So, and I think you've got two paths right there. One may be, I'm never going to step foot on the property. I live 2 states away. This is totally an investment, and we'll see where we stand 30 years from now. The other would be a recreationally, I want to enjoy this property, and maybe we'll realize some income from it. But it's like the three of us, what we see more often now, and of course, I'm very biased with what I'm about to say. We're working with people, their number one motivation is wildlife, and then on down the priority list might be realizing some income for timber. The timber has become a liability. It is literally because of the markets and all these various reasons. It's I don't want that timber on my property, or I want to reduce the quantity of it by a minimum of 50%, and I can't do anything with it. So, very big picture question there, but what kind of guidance can we provide people on, is this something you need to do? Do you need to plant trees going forward?
See, you guys see how he painted me into a corner there and threw some broken glass on the ground after he stole my shoes, right? I don't totally disagree with the premise of what you're saying there, but again, a lot of that goes back to goals of ownership, right? Oh, it's not and a lot of this is location specific, but it's also crop specific. So, I mean, forestry is just it's a long-term agriculture is all it is, right? From an active forestry management standpoint. Um, when you start talking about hardwoods, obviously we still got value. We still have a lot of value there. That's never been a question. You just got a lot longer rotation. So it's a multi-generational investment almost when you're planting hardwoods. But staying focused on pines, it's not worthless, and that's a little bit of a misconception that people have. It still has value. It does not have the value it once did. If you go back and you look at a lot of my predecessors that were here for the good old days, the glory days, the golden era of pine silviculture in Mississippi, a lot of that wood, I mean, I've personally sold wood too for 50, good pine saw logs for $58, $60, $62 a ton. That same wood now, just 20 years older, you're looking at 15, 16 bucks a ton in that same part of the world, right? It still has value. It's not totally worthless. They were operating on something like 30, 35% rate of return back then. I mean, it was a very solid investment. The old, what's the old phrase that Tim Troggett used to say, $150 an acre a year? Well, those days are gone, right? They've been gone for a long time. If you pin an economist down, and none of them want to go on record, they'll tell you it's still paying 4 or 5%, somewhere in that range. So there are other investments that pay more, sure, but there are investments like a savings account that don't. Okay. So it is still viable. It is still valid. It's just that it doesn't carry what it used to. The biggest problem with it is you have to get it past that thinning stage. That's the kicker. That's the bottleneck where everything starts to fall apart. So there are strategies to get around that. If it's something you wanted to do, and it comes down to lower densities, better genetics, lower densities. Now, the whole genetics thing has gotten us in trouble because it got a lot of trees real big, real quick, right? But it is a viable option to plant some of the higher, for lack of better terminology, some of the higher quality seedlings that are out there that allow you to plant a much, much, much lower density on the ground, wider spacings, and you get that tree to small saw log status before you actually come in and quote unquote thin. You still have to thin, and there's always going to be something that's pulpwood size. It doesn't matter what stand or what genes you have in those trees. You're always going to have something that's, trash, I guess you should say, for lack of better phrasing, out of those stands. But you're hoping to get things to a saw log status. Small saw log used to be chip and saw, right? Nobody even says chip and saw for the most part now. Now it's just small diameter saw logs. You're trying to get it to that stage before you have to do something to that stand, and it's working. It is working with the proper genetics behind those trees. And I don't want to get on the genetics, kick here, but you have to have both. You have to have the lower spacing and the better genes. It also lends into your world more, that wider space, and you're maintaining green stuff on the ground for a lot longer period of time. Now, when you start talking about prioritization of goals, when I went through forestry school, and I'm starting to date myself here, we're talking in the early 2000s. Yeah. And the guys that taught me and the guys that I worked with that have been in the business for a long time, it was all about timber. That's not the case anymore, even outside of industry. Outside of industry that's growing timber for profit, I think any forester would be remiss to not admit, at least, that maybe they don't promote, but at least admit that wildlife and the recreational benefits and things like that is at least as important, in a lot of cases, a lot more important to the actual landowner that you're working for than the actual timber value, and that's absolutely fair. I work in the Delta region, right? I work in the Delta and in the hills and in the Northwest. I don't pitch forestry for commercial purposes. I pitch forestry as a way to pay for your wildlife efforts. Buy a truck for your grandkid to go to college in. Have a nest egg for retirement. I mean, there's other benefits that go along with it, but the vast majority of people that I work with, at least equal to the forest management side of it, the commercial forest side of it, wildlife habitat's definitely on there. Absolutely. And as a landowner, I can tell you right now, hands down, my little chunk of ground, I'm thinking about hunting it. I'm thinking about doing things out there on the property more than I am the value of the hardwoods that are growing on it. And that's just the reality of it. You have to adapt. So our field has changed. And because it's changed, and because a lot of those changes in perception of what's out there and what you can do with it, I don't want to say we've been forced. To a certain extent, we probably have, but we've adapted. We've moved, or most foresters have, to something that's centric around wildlife and forestry at the same time. And that's just the way it is. anybody tells you it, and they're not telling you the truth. That's just the way it is, and at least in my region up here. Nothing wrong with wildlife, even if I do pick at you about it.
Nah, nothing wrong with timber either.
Wildlife tastes good, man.
It sure does. Yeah. See if this is still accurate, Brady.
Mhm.
We did some research with James Henderson. Good grief. I find myself saying, "Oh, it's 5 or 6 years ago,"
Nah.
and then I start doing like, "Son of a gun, that was like 15 years ago." And there was a lot of conclusions from it, but one of the big takeaways for me was, in areas, if you have an interest in both, I want some timber as an investment, but I also want wildlife habitat. And so when we add in that issue of we are going to plant some timber on this property, where we ended with that research, and again, the economics of it was you are far better doing it in the areas that are going to have the greatest site index and areas where you're going to be able to logistically harvest that timber. In other words, planting timber in the suboptimal areas and then trying to manage for it, you were not getting a return on investment, nearly as much on the timber management. And so we ended up with a good equal ground for let's plant timber where it's going to grow well and where we can manage it and where we can harvest it. And all those areas where it's not going to grow well, don't even waste your time putting pine on the ground, planting it. Let's manage that for wildlife habitat. And that economically ended up to be the best solution relative to the objectives of how do we improve wildlife habitat and simultaneously how do we manage our timber financially. Does that still hold in this day and age?
Just remember, you're treading dangerously on the heels of stand conversion there when you start talking that right? Cut the tops of the ridge and plant pines. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that in some of the old literature. But on a serious side of that, I think so. I think so. Once you get into planting anything in a suboptimal setting, so hardwoods in places they're not supposed to be, pines in places they're not supposed to be, you run into trouble down the road. Maybe not every time, but you run into it enough that Mother Nature reminds you of why you shouldn't have. And if she doesn't, the markets dang sure will at some point. So I think that holds true to a certain extent, and it's also I'll further that a step further. When you start looking at investments in those optimal areas, that's where you put the most money. Not just a matter of you put trees there, but you put not only trees, but that's where you sock all of that management money. That's where you put the best genetics. That's where you do the best chemical work. That's where you make sure your site prep's done in the right way. Because and again, I'm not an economist, but over and over and over, their research shows you that that's where your bang for your buck is in maximizing growth on that particular acreage. Once you drop off into the others, if you are doing it from a forest management standpoint, you can't afford to sink as much money in, and whether or not it's good wildlife ground for whatever target species you're trying to manage, that's up for debate. But from a pure forestry standpoint, that pretty much holds true still. Not that everybody does it, but it, you may not have the ground too that's capable of being or categorized as being optimal. So if you want trees on it, you're going to be planting trees on something that's not. I mean, we get hung up in that landscape size arena, but the guy with 40 acres doesn't always have that option at hand.
Yeah, it can also be, and some people may find it shocking that the three of us would recommend some of these things about let's make a closed canopy scenario. Let's have this area and let's grow timber, but we can actually use that to
Sure.
our advantage. And what I mean by that is something we have to be concerned about on the deer side primarily is access.
Mhm.
How are we going to enter certain areas and exit certain areas without disturbing or minimizing the disturbance. And what we will see time and time again is there will be a primary access to a stand or to a hunting area where you're driving right through your cover.
Yeah.
Or you got to go right by a food plot to get so we can actually use things like a dense canopy of trees or even a pasture, things like that, to where there are areas on the property where we do not want deer bedded or feeding, and we're going to use that for humans, to access the property and different hunting areas. So that's an opportunity that we can use in that regard.
And I don't think of things quite like that from a hunting strategy standpoint, but I mean, that's sound. That makes sense. I think about it as if you're wanting to do wildlife work, and I'm telling you, I've already said it, this is how I pitch it. If you're wanting to do that wildlife work, here's a way to make enough money to pay for it. Most people don't like coming out of pocket. You guys deal with the ones that do, right? It's recreation. I don't. Most of the ones that I deal with, they want to be able to pay for it somehow, and that's an easy way to do it. You're doing that work while you're being paid to do it. It's they go hand in hand. They work pretty well together. But yeah, there's lots of things that could be said about that.
While we're speaking about money for just a second, Brady, let's jump back to kind of the ice damage and everything really quick. And just, is there anything that landowners need to be doing? Like, do they need to get anybody out on their property to look at damage, or can they, they take note of damage either for tax purposes or for some kind of cost share in the future to repair stands or to replant or anything like that? Is there anything that landowners need to be doing now?
Yes. And I'm not the guy to give a casualty loss talk at all, right? Or tax implications. Like, I'm not even going to go there. But yes, there are reasons to do that type of work now. And I mean, 5 minutes. I didn't tell you this, guys, but I mean, my internet crashed like 5 minutes before I got on here to record a while ago. And while I was reading an email that came from MFA, where it went down on me, so I didn't get all the details, but they have USDA has approved some cost share money now. So EFRP, Emergency Forest Restoration Program has been reapproved to do that. And then there's some other things that have been approved too. That are, on the ag side of things, but along with some of that program money that's going to come out, you're going to need to be able to prove that you had damage. You're going to need to go through some steps to be able to enter into those programs and to be eligible for some of that money. So I don't know what all those are. I mean, I literally saw it 5 minutes before we got on here to talk. They just came down with that ruling or that issuance of information. But I know in the past with that program in particular, it wasn't eligible for yard owners, residential stuff. It had to be a forestry venture that had been on the ground before, and you had to jump through steps to get into that program. From a tax standpoint and a casualty loss standpoint, to be able to deduct those things and do all that kind of work, yes, you have to establish value. So it's one of those things of getting somebody on the ground and getting them there quick, and getting good pictures and things like that. I'm not familiar with how all that stuff works. I'll be blunt right there, but there's some steps to take. Some of those steps, don't knee jerk it, right? Don't make just some assumption. You walk out and you look and your stand looks rough, so it's going to die. That's not necessarily the case because of some of the things we already talked about. There's some things that that may or may not happen on the ground out there. And you wait 6 months, and we may have a huge beetle outbreak, and everything we're talking about here is off the reality table. And that's possible, but don't knee jerk it right now. It's possible that something is going to be okay. Okay. If it looks like a bush hog went over the top, obviously, it's done, but those that are in between, they might be okay. So don't overact. get a forester out there, get somebody to look at it, explore the possibilities of some of the help money, the aid, the federal aid that comes down, and then stay informed. And that's the biggest thing I can tell anybody right now. If it's salvageable, or you think it's salvageable, or somebody told you it might be salvageable, you really need to get on that, and you need to do it yesterday, because loggers already had long job books. They got real long, even longer, real long, real quick with this for just damaged timber. One of the things, if you're getting close to winding this thing up, one of the things that I would like to point out to folks that have that damage on the ground, or some generalities, and I actually made a cheat sheet over here with the numbers, because there's several. Some generalities if you're looking at timber on the ground. So instead of being able to get somebody there, which is going to be difficult, some things you can look at as a landowner to assess it yourself and see. We already talked about the amount of breakage and things like that that's up there in the top of those crowns, but I didn't really talk about the bending and things like that. So if you have a stand that has a lot of bending, rule of thumb, you think about an analog clock, from 1 to 3, or I guess 12 to 9, if you went to the other side. Once trees get into that 1 o'clock position, anything below 1 o'clock, you're probably okay. You get into that 130 kind of range there, about 45%, that's where you start really having to worry about it, okay? Once you get to 2 o'clock, you probably are done. You're into that severe category. You're not going to be able to do anything with it. And once you get above about 30%, actual breakage, that's where you need to start really thinking about, do I need to continue managing this? Once you get in that 50% range, that's where you're probably potentially looking at a do-over, right? 60, 70 is done. So that's just some rough numbers for people to kind of look at. Branch dieback isn't as big of a deal as people think, or branch loss, I guess, isn't as big of a deal as a lot of people think it is. You can take about 40, 50% branch, breakage in a pine tree before it becomes something that's probably going to kill the tree. You get past about 50% on an individual tree, you're going to run into some issues. Top breakage, once you get above 3 or 4 inches in diameter on a big tree, and of course it varies depending on the size of the tree, but on a big tree, a mature tree, once you get above maybe 5 inches or so in diameter, you probably need to start thinking about doing something with those. One thing we didn't talk about at all was coming from the lean and some of the structural things that can happen inside the tree, things like ring shake, where the thing about growth rings will actually separate and slide against each other. So even though that tree, if it was bent over, even though that tree looks it looks sound, a lot of times more in windstorms than with ice, but even in ice storms, that if that tree leaned over and those rings separated out, you can get some problems when you put it on the saw. When you put it on that gang, it'll actually come apart. It'll fray out on you. And then as you manage those stands into the future, one of the things that not a lot of folks are thinking about is compression wood and tension wood. So on the leaned side, on the downside of the lean, inside the elbow, so to speak, you'll get compression wood. That has a totally different wood property than normal wood. Same thing with tension wood, but once you get into compression wood, and tension wood being on the outside of the elbow, once you get into compression wood, it does some really bad stuff when they try to put it into pulpwood and things like that. So those are just general considerations. I know I may have jumped around on you there, but those, I wanted to make sure to mention those.
Just for my own peace of mind, will you go over the other 2 options when we were talking about, 20 minutes ago, the options? You said you had 4 options for most of the stands. We went over the first 2, the first one being just walking away from the stand, and the second one being you got fired to enter the stand. Just for my own peace of mind, so I can sleep tonight without calling you, what's the other 2?
There you go. The other 2. So the burning scenario, you can come back and plant, or you can spray, or you can do the normal forestry stuff. You probably are still going to have a lot of fuel sitting on the ground, big fuel, heavy fuel, down woody material, whatever you want to call it. The third option is you spray it, and I've seen this a lot with tornado damage. You just come over the top, spray it, and enter plant underneath it. I could show you several places down in Carroll County, Montgomery County, things like that, or places like that after the big storm we had back in 2021, 2022, whatever it was, when the big tornado blew through and knocked a lot of that ground off, a lot of those trees on the ground. There were quite a few people. I could think of 5 or 6 off the top of my head anyway that had a herbicide applicator go over the top, spray them, and they went back in and just replanted. So it's not the normal that we expect to do. You've got a lot of dead trees standing up. You've got almost a 2-age stand in some cases if they had anything that was still alive, but you have a lot of snags and things like that. Make Bronson happy, woodpecker habitat, right? You got a lot of that kind of stuff sitting there, and then trees growing up underneath it. That's the third option, and then the fourth option, which there are some people that do it, but it and you know where we're going with this. It gets into pushing it up with a dozer and burning it, and then starting over from that side of the world, and that's unbelievably expensive. Low end, $1,500-$1,800 an acre, all the way up to $4,000 or $5,000 an acre, and you just can't afford to do it. But there are people that, by George, we're gonna get this back. It's gonna be planted back, and I've dealt with a few of those. It's incredibly expensive unless you own a dozer yourself and are willing to do it at nights on the weekends. It's going to be outrageously expensive. So those are very, very fast paraphrased, right?
Thank you, Brady.
Well, Brady, thank you for spending time with us and educating us on the issue and things that people can do. I guess from my perspective, I would, and again, recognizing the bias here and who are the people we're interacting with the most and what their objectives are. I would say, and it really, really stinks that your hand may be forced with Mother Nature and what happened here. But I don't know if this is a positive outcome, but I guess an outcome would be maybe use this time to reassess truly what your objectives are. And this may be an opportunity to reset and forecast the next 2 or 3 decades. And, so you may have been in a situation where, hey, wasn't really what I thought I signed up for, managing for timber, but we're halfway through the process or we're 90%, through the process. So we're going to ride it out and monetize this opportunity. So maybe that opportunity has been taken away, and for you to envision, what you want to do for your land or that portion of your land going forward. So I don't know if that's a positive at all, but it is an opportunity to, I guess, think about the future and what you want out of your property. So Brady, thank you. And for people that aren't familiar, Brady is the co-host of a podcast called Timber University, and it is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. So a wealth of information there, both with Timber University, Deer University, and many, many others. So a great resource for people to get this type of information. Thank you, Brady, for what you do. And we really appreciate your service to Mississippi and to landowners. And any closing thoughts for you, Brady, or how people can get a hold of you?
Oh, well, you can get a hold of me probably right now, especially the easiest ways to email, and that'd be Brady, BRADY .self, SELF, at MSstate, one word, 2 S's, .edu. Or you can call the phone here, 1-662-226-6000, and you can get me. I promise you, I will get back with you. I don't have a secretary here anymore. It's just me. So there are times where I'm on the road for 3 or 4 days, especially right now. But I'll get back with anybody that calls. I promise. Outside of that, it's kind of like I said on our episode of TU the other day. It's I feel for a lot of people out there. It's bad, and just going back to exactly what you said, it may. I think it will force. I don't think it may. I think it will force people to reassess what they really want to do with some of that ground. And to be honest, there were people doing that to begin with anyway. I think this is going to provide a little bit more of a flash in jump starting those people to do that kind of work. if they were affected in this part of the world. So do feel really, really bad for a lot of people that are out there. A lot of people lost retirement funds, places they had planted with their granddad, things like that. So it's bad. We feel for you. And some of us are in the same boat. What it comes down to.
Heartbreaking for a lot of people. No question about it. Real stories, real lives, and a lot of hurt going on in that area. But thank you, Brady.
Mhm.
We appreciate your time, and we'll do it again sometime.
All right.
Thanks for listening to the Wildlife Investments Podcast. For more information on these topics or to see some of the projects our team is working on, follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wildlife Investments or visit wildlifeinvestments.com.